welcome to another edition of Laguna Woods Stories. And today we have a very interesting story with a very interesting woman in some very interesting garb. And sitting across from me is Marcia Maloney. And Marcia, why are you dressed this way?
Well, it's been 400 years since the Mayflower came into Plymouth and
Yes.
Provincetown, Cape Cod. And in 2020, we're going to be celebrating by putting a float in the Rose Parade in Pasadena.
And you're going to be on that float.
I'm going to be on it.
And you are wearing the costume that has been made for that float. Is that right?
Right. And we call it pilgrim attire.
Okay.
The pilgrims, unknown to me before I joined the Mayflower Society, I thought they wore black and buckles. Well, that was later when the Puritans came in. Black was expensive. And the Pilgrims didn't have a lot of money.
No.
So they wore colors. And some of them on that ship were tailors.
So they had good clothes.
They did have good clothes. I'm not sure what they really looked like when they got here. But we're lucky that we have William Bradford's journal, which had been lost for years in England, and someone found it.
Now we have a picture of what the float is going to look like. We'll put that on the screen here. And so you are going to be one of the people standing in the small boat there?
I think I'm going to be in the shallop.
In the shallop.
So it'll be easier because the float is really big. Fiesta Parade Floats is putting it together for us in Irwindale. And they have won many awards. They're a wonderful float builder. So they've designed this rendering for us.
Now this is based on the actual.
The actual Mayflower, yes. There's a Mayflower 2, which is usually in Plymouth Harbor. Right now it's in Connecticut, getting ready for 2020 to come into Plymouth. Right.
I have been on the reproduction of the Mayflower 2.
Right. Well, you're a descendant of the Mayflower.
I am. And we didn't even mention that Marcia, you are descended from people who came in the Mayflower. Who are you descended from?
Richard Moore, who was a child Mayflower passenger. And James Chilton, who died he was the oldest person on the float, and he died at age 61 that first winter. And Richard Warren. And I always wanted to be connected to Richard Warren because so many people like Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Alan Shepard, the first astronaut in space. So I was thrilled when through genealogy, that I discovered those connections. So I promptly joined the Mayflower Society.
All right. How many descendants of the Mayflower are there in the country? Do you have any idea?
We project that about 38 million people are descendants. Of those 102, actually 51 people that survived. 102 people started out, and half died that first hard winter.
Yes, including two of my descendants, or ancestors, I should say. Two of my ancestors, the Tilleys, husband and wife, and parents of my 12 times great-grandmother, Elizabeth Tilley, who married John Howland. So,
and that's another story in itself.
That's quite a story, yes.
John Howland fell off the ship in those rough seas. He shouldn't have been up on deck anyway.
No.
But he did go out to get a breath of fresh air.
He was probably a teenager, or maybe a little older than that at the time.
They say that he was. But he has so many descendants. John and Priscilla Alden probably have the most, because they had 10 children, I think.
And I think the Howlands had 10 children.
Quite a few also. And the Howlands, we kind of chuckle because, of course, he was up in Maine a lot.
Yes.
And that's why there are a lot of descendants up in the Maine area. But somebody, I think in William Bradford's journal, as a matter of fact, it says something that calls John Halland a lusty young man.
Right.
And we go, no wonder there were so many kids. I always get a kick out of that. So.
Yep. My ancestor.
But you know, the ship got started late.
Yes.
2 months later than they had expected to
Well, they started out somewhat earlier, as I understand, with 2 ships, and one of them proved unseaworthy, the Speedwell, was it?
Speedwell, that's exactly right. And they had to go back a couple of times, back to England. They started in Holland, where half of the ship's passengers had been for
some years.
20 years or 10 years.
Some time period. You didn't have any choice of religion back in those days. Wherever you lived, the king would determine what your religion was, and you either had to go to that church or be arrested.
Right.
And I think the Pilgrims finally escaped to Holland to have some degree of religious freedom.
Exactly.
And after, I think, a decade or so there, they were unhappy with living in Holland, so they decided to go to the New World. And there was there were some settlements already in the New World, and there was a lot of fishing and that sort of thing. So it wasn't really as if it were totally unknown.
Right. Well, I still think you have to look at it like it was a bunch of trees. There weren't any stores. There weren't any drugstores.
No.
You know, the float is called The Voyage of Hope 1620, which works right into Laura Farber, who's the president of the Tournament of Roses this year. Her theme is the power of hope.
Okay.
So with this title, it's so appropriate. And the reason I mention hope is because those people did go to the Netherlands, as you mentioned, bless the Dutch people, because they were fairly lenient with letting people live their own lives. And as you know, they're still like that today.
Right.
I just love the Dutch people. So they were in Amsterdam, and then they moved to Leiden, and they were there, which is south. And William Brewster was a professor at the University of Leiden. So they lived there, but what happened is that 2 things. The children were becoming Dutch.
Well, Dutch was their first language.
And so even though it was a nice culture, the other thing is people that weren't Dutch usually worked in menial positions. And it was hard for them to get ahead.
Right.
So they eventually, that's why they decided, hey, let's go to America. And they thought they were going to Virginia. I think you probably know that story. Ended up further, and we think when they said Virginia, they probably meant like Maryland, Chesapeake Bay area, and then because of the storms got blown off course and ended up in Massachusetts. Or
perhaps the ship's captain was bribed to take them farther north, which is one theory.
I just think it's amazing, all the wonderful stories. My Richard Moore, child Mayflower man, didn't sign the Mayflower Compact. However, he and his 3 brothers and sisters were sent away with their father. And for years, people thought they were poor little waifs from the streets of London. Well, why would that be when they had to crowd on the ship to come? And a lot of people had to be left behind with the Speedwell. So in about 1952, there was a family member in England who was going through his family's old desk and found evidence of a nasty divorce that took place in the around 1616. 16.
Children were separated from their parents because of the divorce and exiled basically to...
And their mother never knew what happened to them.
Oh, my goodness.
And then they fought this horrible divorce, which is recorded in the English court
And you're descended from these...
I'm a direct descendant. And Richard Moore, it's unusual to find descendants from Richard Moore because he was the only one of the 4 sisters and brothers that survived that first winter. which
Yeah.
is a very sad story.
Let's talk about the Mayflower Compact. You mentioned it in passing, and this was an extremely important document in the history of the United States.
Right.
People imagined that everybody on the Mayflower was of the same religious group, but they were not. Only half or so.
Well, I think they say half were the Pilgrims.
Yeah.
They call them the saints.
Yeah.
And they call the other half the strangers,
Yeah.
of which John Alden was one.
Right.
And they came along. He was the ship's cooper.
Cooper, meaning a maker of barrels.
Right,
which was an essential craft in those days.
Exactly.
For carrying water and beer and
The ale.
and other things.
Yeah. So it's John Alden, as you know, ended up having so many descendants that we go, wow, we're glad they invited him along, but they just picked him up in London.
The Mayflower Compact was an agreement for basically a secular government.
Right.
They were going to be self-governed,
Right.
Not by the religious leaders,
Right.
but
By all of them.
By all of them, which was really a remarkable document. It was put together after they arrived, before they got off the ship.
Before they disembarked, and it was it's the basis for American democracy,
Yeah.
as you alluded to. They say that you can compare a lot of the verbiage in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence to the Mayflower Compact. So that's probably why is the Mayflower important to us today.
Right.
Because the Mayflower Compact, and they came in families, they came to stay.
Right. And that's because some of the other settlements were mostly male. They were mostly young
Right.
men who were looking to make a fortune. And
Right. They had their servants with them.
Yeah, so the people who came on the Mayflower, for the most part, expected to stay there, which would be really kind of beyond our thinking that you would set out on a voyage. It would almost be as if we were going to another planet or something like that. You set off on a voyage and have almost no hope of ever going back.
Exactly, not knowing what they were coming to.
Right.
And, so they were scared, but they were very courageous, and we need to be so thankful for what they brought us, because, again, with half dying that first winter, and that led to Thanksgiving,
Right.
which on our float we've taken a little poetic license. Here it is 1620, there's the rock, there's the Mayflower Compact, but then we've got some flowers and gourds and pumpkins and things that were eaten the first Thanksgiving, which
wouldn't have happened in 1620 because it was just winter.
Right. But it was the children that survived.
Right.
There were only 4 women left. They had to cook that Thanksgiving dinner. I like to think the Native Americans helped cook it too.
I imagine they did. Yeah.
But and there were, I can't remember how many men, but not a huge. And so the children had to work really hard, and it took them a while to get their cottages built.
Right.
And
it's kind of interesting that at first they had their gardens were all in common, and they tried to get everybody to voluntarily work in the gardens and raise the produce, which would keep them alive. I mean, it was essential for life.
Right.
And they found out that didn't work very well, and the next year they gave everybody their own garden space, and if you don't garden, you don't eat. If you don't eat, you don't live.
Right.
So there was a certain urgency to.
Right. And of course, we give the Native Americans credit too, because they taught us how to fish.
Right.
And how to plant corn that really saved their lives. And they were very friendly with each other. The Pilgrims and Native Americans signed a peace treaty that lasted 57 years.
Yeah.
That's like almost 3 generations.
Yeah, we forget. We know that there were later on there were terrible wars,
Right.
well, French and Indian War,
Right.
but there were terrible wars between the settlers. But that was much later. The early settlers came to terms with
Right.
the Indians. It was Native Americans. It was mutually beneficial.
Right.
The Native Americans got all kinds of manufactured things like knives and
Right.
pots and things like that they didn't have
Right.
access to, and the Pilgrims learned how to farm, and learned how to grow corn, and learned what corn maize was, and learned how to fish for the local fish, and
Exactly.
had it not been for this agreement between the natives and the Pilgrims,
Right.
they would not have survived.
Right. I think what people don't realize, at least I didn't, is the Native Americans, the different tribes were fighting each other.
Right.
So the Wampanoags wanted our protection,
Yes.
and we needed them to learn to grow corn and things.
Right.
And I think William Bradford was the passenger who saved either Squanto
Yes.
or Massasoit's life.
Right.
And so they were dear friends until they
Right.
each died, you know.
Well, the story of Squanto is remarkable. He had, as a child, been captured and taken actually to Spain by fishermen, and wanted to eventually to get back home, and somehow made his way to England, and after several voyages to the new land, but never getting to his own place, he was taken there.
Right.
Years later, knowing English, and found that his whole tribe had been wiped out in disease.
Decimated. Yeah.
And the area where the Pilgrims settled was space that had been occupied by his own tribe, and he lived the rest of his life
Right.
with
And
the
yeah,
Pilgrims.
they took care of each other and loved
Yeah.
each other.
Yes.
But it's amazing to think that here the Pilgrims were on this little beach near Plymouth Rock, and they were scared and cold, and they'd gotten off that ship where they'd been huddled into the middle of it,
Yes.
and people were seasick and having babies,
Uh-huh.
and
I think the first baby born on the trip was called Oceana.
right,
Yeah.
Hopkins. And because of that, they just really were thrilled when Squanto walked into their settlement and said, "Howdy, Englishman," or "Hello, Englishman," or something
Yes,
like
yes.
that.
Spoke to
they
them.
must have gone, "Oh my
surprised.
God!"
Spoke to them in English.
right,
And,
in
yeah,
English.
and he was their interpreter with the various Indian tribes around. And,
Right.
And
Right.
so.
Yeah, like I say, interesting, and many, many interesting stories. They you just think about how scary it must have been when they left the people they loved
Yeah.
to come this way. And how did they select the people that were going to come and the people that were going to stay? As we started to talk about earlier, is the ship came in November. And so it was 2 or 3 months later. I think they were going to originally leave in June or July, so they'd get here in the fall and they'd still have time to plant some crops. So by November, it was freezing cold and you didn't plant crops.
Right.
So that's why they starved. And I think you mentioned to me earlier that one of your other ancestors came in on the second ship the following year.
That's right.
So
yes.
our people were starving, and we had to feed more people that had come in.
Yeah, the investors. I think a lot of people don't realize that the money to pay for the Mayflower, et cetera, had come from investors who.
Right.
Who expected to make some money on the deal, and the Pilgrims and others had signed paperwork pledging to pay off the
Right.
debt, and so the investors had sent another ship. I guess that was the Fortune. The next summer with more mouths to feed, but without any supplies.
Exactly. And it took them a while to be able to pay the investors back.
Yes.
And it became, actually, it was quite hopeless for a while. They thought, how are we ever going to get out from under this debt? Right. However, the way they did is the fur trade.
Yes. Oh, what do you have there?
This is sort of a fur, a rabbit fur.
Oh, okay.
But the fur that they used
beavers for
was
one thing.
beaver fur.
Yes.
And up in Maine, where some of your ancestors were.
Well, John Howland.
Is that what he was doing up there?
Ran a trading post in Maine to trade with the natives and get beaver skins and that sort of thing, and trade other things to the natives that they could use. So that's how he happened to be in Maine for some little time.
Right.
He ended up being a judge.
And did he?
Yes.
But that brings us to another story, and that is of Plymouth Rock itself, which we're all familiar with. And people say, how do we know that they stepped on Plymouth Rock?
In fact, we don't really.
And we go see it, and all of us, you've seen it, I've seen it, and it's this little rock.
Not that impressive.
Well, what happened was they moved it, and it got chopped up over the years, and tourists took pieces away. Right. And then when they moved it from Town Dock, where it originally was, to where it is now, it broke in half. And no wonder it's little. It probably was a lot bigger. But my point was going to be, when Mary Chilton stepped onto the shore on the rock, we who were brought up in New England know that when you get out of a kayak or a boat or a canoe, where do you step? You don't step on that kind of mushy land. You step on a rock.
If possible. Yeah.
So being a New Englander, I've always said they had to have stepped on that rock.
The current situation of the rock is not that near the water, so it's on sand, but some distance from the.
Right, they did move it, and so, but it's near Mayflower 2. You said you've been on Mayflower 2. Mayflower 2. We don't know what happened to the original Mayflower. It went back to England. I think it went on maybe 2 voyages after that.
Yeah,
never
it was
to the New
an
World.
old ship kind of at the end of its life.
Right, so it disappeared. But then in 1950, people, there were designs of all the other ships at that time period. So in the 1950s, a group of people built a Mayflower in England. I don't know if it was in England or somewhere there, and sailed it, made it as an exact replica as they could, and they sailed it to this country, and it's been harbored in Plymouth Harbor. That's called the Mayflower 2.
Okay. I didn't realize that ship had sailed across the ocean.
Right. Yeah. So it's now down in Connecticut, as we talked about earlier, in dry dock, getting fixed, because obviously it costs millions of dollars to maintain this, and Plymouth Plantation maintains it. So
especially a wooden ship that would be subject to rot. And
exactly.
That, yeah.
So next year, in 2020, our parade's going to start the year off on January 1. But throughout the year, there'll be celebrations.
I'm sure we'll be hearing a good deal about the Mayflower, the 400th anniversary of their.
We might be Mayflowered out by that.
We might be. And so when we, from the comfort of our homes, watch the New Year's Day parade, you'll be out there in whatever weather there is in the very costume you're wearing now.
Right. And this pilgrim attire that I have, and that we selected about 17 riders for the float, and that was based on, and they're coming from all over the country, but you can imagine most of them are Californians because it's easier for us.
Right.
But we have part of the Mayflower Guard coming from Indiana, and he's going to be dressed like Miles Standish and walk along the ship. So hopefully he'll protect us.
That was the job of the original Miles Standish, a very necessary role in those days.
Yeah.
They built a blockhouse and were concerned about their safety.
Right.
Yeah.
But the clothing has been studied by a dear lady named Jane Wong, who's also from Maine, by the way.
Okay.
And she studied that whole Jacobean time period in clothing. I think she worked in Hollywood for a while. She graduated from Cornell, and she really knows clothing. So she's done a great deal to dress us.
Right.
People had to invest in their outfits. This is woolen. I'm wearing a partlet with my collar, and linen and woolens were the primary. We didn't have any polyesters back.
No.
So if you had the correctly designed attire, you had a good chance of getting selected to ride on that float.
Okay. So what you see will be more characteristic of what the people actually wore than the black
and
black hats with buckles and all that, which was all invented much later.
Right. Well, and when I sent the picture of all of us filming up at the Tournament of Roses house, they said, "That's the nicest looking group of pilgrims we've ever seen," because you can well imagine what they smelled like and what they look like when they get off that ship.
Yeah, there weren't exactly showers on the ship.
No, exactly. And so this one's going to smell a lot better because of the flowers. And but we needed to have a little fun, so that's why we wanted to.
Well, Marcia, we have run out of time, but thank you so much for coming in and wearing your authentic costume here, and just remind us that we will be in 2020 celebrating the 400th year anniversary of the arrival of the Mayflower.
Right.
Thank you again.
You're very welcome. And if anyone would like to send a donation, we have a website. We're all self decorated.
And we will put that on the screen for people to see.
Good. Thank you, Tom. It's been fun talking to another Mayflower descendant.
Thank you.